commercial real estate language, and feel free to stop me with questions, although at the end I will definitely open it up to questions. If there's something that I don't cover, there will also be a prize if you can stump me. If you can ask me what something is and I don't know, okay? Lots of ways to win prizes today. All right, and again, hopefully everyone can see my screen and hear me. If you can't, just interrupt me, please. All right, so first of all, the basics. Actually, most of this is basics, but when we talk about commercial property, what types of property is that? Well, we define them into categories: commercial office, industrial properties, retail properties, multifamily. And fun fact about multifamily, to be considered a commercial property, the multifamily property has to have 5 units or more. So if you own a duplex or a fourplex, technically that's residential. Why is that important? The short answer is because there's different financing options available. When you go to purchase a home, there are different financing options available. Many of those options are available if you wanted to purchase a duplex or even a fourplex. Once you get to 5 units or more, it falls under the commercial umbrella, and you're looking at more conventional types of loans for those. So fun fact about multifamily. Retail is a commercial property type, and then specialty. We'll dive into more of those later on. So of course, in those categories, we have all kinds of fun subcategories, right? Some more on property types. When we talk about office properties, in the Inland Empire, we categorize them into Class A, Class B, and Class C. Class A is exactly what you would imagine. Those are newer buildings that are 3 stories or greater. We sometimes will say, oh, they have museum quality finishes. So that's things like marble floors, brass fixtures. Those are typically Class A. Another fun fact, when brokers or investors or tenants come to the Inland Empire and say they're looking for Class A, they have a different picture in their mind, right? They're thinking downtown LA high rise, Manhattan high rise. What is the Inland Empire version of that? There is a handful of office buildings, and we call those Class A, even though they're only 5 or 6 stories. Class B that can still be a quality building, right? It can still have some of those museum quality finishes. I'm diving way too deep into this because I'm an office broker, but Class B is where is a 2-story building, right? Class B is still nice. And then Class C is like an office condo, a 1-story multi-tenant building. I have multi-tenant here as a term to know. And the difference is whether there's a single user in a building, right? Your doctor's office, maybe it's only your doctor's office. Or is that doctor in a multi-tenant building, right? So you go into a lobby, you take the elevator to the 2nd floor to visit your doctor, and you pass other doctors' offices on the way. That's an example of a multi-tenant office building versus a standalone. And medical office buildings, sometimes you'll see those or hear those referred to as MOB, which obviously stands for medical office building. Those are a unique property type within the office category. Specifically with regards to parking, medical offices require more parking than a standard office building. Obviously, ADA and accessibility is hugely important in a medical building. And then sometimes power and plumbing. So if you are an attorney or a CPA, you probably don't have plumbing in your private office, right? Perhaps in a kitchen and everyone shares it. In a medical building, those smaller rooms often require plumbing, sometimes require more electrical than someone who's in advertising, right? Because of the machines and things that are used. So that's office. Quick question, and you don't have to answer, but just food for thought. Most of you probably work in an office building if and when we ever stop working from home. And so what category of office building do you occupy? Industrial property types. Okay. Oh, any questions? Okay, cool. Industrial property types. Okay, so this is a fun one too. Distribution I was muted. Did someone need to jump in?
Nope, we're good.
Okay, cool. Okay, industrial property types. Distribution center versus warehouse. In commercial real estate, we categorize a warehouse specifically for the purpose of storing goods. Now, certainly if we are storing goods inside of a warehouse, trucks will come to deliver the goods, other trucks will come to pick up those goods and move on, right? Distribution centers are where that is the purpose of the property, to facilitate these logistics, right? The income of goods, the outward distribution of goods. Distribution centers are designed to facilitate all of that flow. So when we talk about a warehouse building, when we talk about an Amazon logistics center, that's a distribution center. A lot of times people will ask me, hey, what are all those warehouses being built? And technically, they're distribution centers, right? Warehouses are smaller, older. The goal of a warehouse building is basically how much can I store within this footprint, right? The distribution center, they have to look at things like geography and traffic flow. And for example, I put a little fun fact down here. Amazon just opened or will be opening its 14th distribution center in the Inland Empire. It's located in Banning, Beaumont area. It's going to be 4 stories. So what do I accomplish with a 4-story distribution center? Well, I can increase the truck flow, the traffic flow that's coming in because I can build ways for those trucks to get rid of goods on multiple levels, right? Then I have my robotics and hopefully my human teams as well, but my robotics take those goods, they move it to the opposite side of the building where now I have a whole other influx of trucks ready to back it up, be loaded, and move along, right? So that's the difference between a distribution center and a warehouse. And in the Empire, another fun fact, we are the strongest industrial market in the entire world. The reason being, because of our proximity, it's twofold. Our proximity to the Port of Los Angeles and Port of Long Beach, which cannot be replicated anywhere else in the world, and because of our availability of land, right? So LA, Orange County does not have the land to build these distribution centers. The Inland Empire still does, and that's why we're the strongest industrial market in the country. Again, way too much info, but fun facts. Okay, other types of industrial property types: manufacturing, cold storage. Questions on those if anyone has one, but they are what they are. When we talk about industrial, we talk about the difference between light industrial and heavy industrial, right? So if I am manufacturing automotive parts and airplane engines, that's an example of a heavy industrial use, right? If I am manufacturing cabinets or printing t-shirts, or even like smaller computer parts, that is an example of a light industrial. So if you hear someone say, oh yeah, that's a heavy industrial zone, or that's a heavy industrial project, or that's a heavy industrial use, think heavy, right? Think metal, emissions, things like that. Light industrial is more fabrication, if that makes sense, okay? And then flex is a term that we use a lot in the industry. A flex industrial property is almost always a lighter industrial use that has some small office component. So again, and perhaps some of your spouses work in these types of environments, or perhaps you and your families own types of these businesses. Again, printing, cabinets, plumbing, things like that, where they have a warehouse component for storage. And then they have an office component where customers can come in, you can have your office, your employees can have a restroom and a little kitchen. That's an example of a flex industrial building. Cool? Awesome. Okay. Retail property types. This one's super fun. Malls, most everyone knows what a mall is. Lifestyle, if we call something a lifestyle center, it is simply an outdoor mall, right? Victoria Gardens, Temecula Promenade, these are lifestyle centers. Power centers are retail centers where they have what we call big box anchors. Those are your Best Buys, your Barnes and Nobles, Kohl's, Target. Power centers where they have an anchor, those large retailers, and then that we call it inline space, the other adjacent retailers that are next to it, right? Your AT&T and Sprint stores, your Hallmark cards, these are power centers. So when we talk about here in Riverside, a project like Riverside Plaza, where we have Trader Joe's and Vaughn's and the movie theater, those are big box anchors. That's an example of a power center, okay? Now, neighborhood centers are what are in most of our neighborhoods, right? They do often have a big anchor that's typically a grocery store, right? You could still refer to that as a big box anchor, but it's smaller in size. You know, your Stater Brothers is probably smaller in size than, you know, the Target at the center down the street, right? Another term for neighborhood center is community center. So if you hear community centers being used in a conversation with regard to retail commercial real estate, it's not the community center that you're thinking about where you maybe held your, you know, your son's bar mitzvah, right? Or you go play racquetball on the weekends. Community centers, when we're talking about retail properties, is the same as a neighborhood center. It still has that big box anchor that may or may not be a standalone, right? I may go to Stater Brothers by my house all the time, even though I never go to the UPS store or the cleaners or the nail salon that's in that neighborhood center. It's still considered that. Now, convenience centers, we used to call them strip malls or strip centers. The PC term now is convenience center. Those are retail centers where you have multiple tenants, right? So a multi-tenant, we talked about that center, but it doesn't have that big anchor. And then of course you have your standalones, right? There's, you know, an Islands restaurant is an example of a standalone. A Dick's Sporting Goods that may just stand alone, right? A party supply store that may just stand, those are standalones. Again, so food for thought, just think out loud. Think of the retail centers, the retail properties that you frequent the most, and how would you classify them with this new understanding? Okay, specialty property types, things like churches, schools. Because of the parking requirements and the assembly use, you have many people within one space. Those are specialty property types. Hospitals and hospitalities, things like resorts, motels, those are also unique, and those are commercial properties where people spend the night, right? So a hospital is different than a medical office building because you can't spend the night at your doctor's office, right? You have to go to a hospital if you are spending the night. Auto dealerships, truck yards are really interesting, and self-storage is also a commercial property type, right? Someone owns all of the units and they charge tenants rent on a very small square footage of that property. When you look at specialty uses, most of these uses are only allowed within special zones that are permitted by the city. So when you talk about city zoning, oftentimes you'll have general commercial zones, right? And within a general commercial zone, I can have an accounting office, or in a general retail zone, I can have a strip center. But if I have a specialty use, like a self-storage or a truck yard, or I want to build a hospital or a hotel, they have to be located within a special zone within the city. So when you hear discussions about that, you know, what zoning, is the zoning permitted? That's what we're trying to figure out. Will the city allow us to have our place of business within this in this geographic location? Cool. Okay. All right. Commercial real estate 101. Basic transaction types. You have a lease, and that is where someone owns the property. So they have legal property ownership, of that right and legal property rights of that property, but they are granting the right of ownership temporarily to someone else for a fixed term at a fixed price. So that's a basic definition of a lease, right? So here's the deal. I own a multi-tenant retail center and I lease a space to you for your hair salon. Both of us have ownership of that space and right to use that space. Your right to use that space is limited to a restricted amount of time, whatever we say in the lease, for 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and at a specific cost. You only can continue to have ownership of that space as long as you pay to me the price that we agree to, right? That's the basics of a lease. Now, as an owner, I still have ownership of that as well. So I'm responsible for the taxes. I can come into your space. Most leases outline when I am allowed to come into your space, right? Because we have to have an agreement. If I own it and you also own it as a tenant, what we come to an agreement on when I can have access and things like that. So those are all outlined in a lease. Now, if I'm a tenant and I am leasing space from someone who also owns the property, and I choose to transfer those rights of ownership to another tenant who is now going to occupy the space that I own, that I lease, right? And they for a set amount of time, and they are going to pay me a fee, that is called a sublease. In essence, then I become the landlord, even though there is a master landlord who owns the property. I now become a landlord and I lease to a subtenant. So that's the difference between a lease and a sublease. Okay. Other basic transaction type is a purchase and sale. The two big ones is that an owner user who owns the building and is occupying all of the building or a portion of the building for their own use. That's considered an owner user purchase. Or when that owner goes to sell the property to another owner who will use the property for their business, that's called an owner user sale. Or there's investment sales. Someone who owns the property does not occupy it, and it's an investment for them, whether that investment is through building equity in the value of the real estate, or the cash flow that comes in from one tenant or multiple tenants. And typically it's a combo of both. The reason we separate these when we look at commercial real estate is because there are different financing options available depending on how your purchase and sale is structured, how you plan to occupy the premises. There's also different criteria for buying and setting prices. For example, if I am a doctor and I'm using real estate, I'm using Riverside as an example because that's where my office is located, but I'm a doctor. I know that I want to be in Riverside, and I don't want to share, in a multi-tenant property. I want my own standalone dentist office, right? I want people to come to me, bring their kids to me to get their teeth cleaned, and I'm not going to compete with the pet groomer and the Stater Brothers next door. I want my own standalone medical office building. If that is supply and demand, right? If there's only two choices that I have, that is going to dictate the price that I would be willing to pay for that property, right? Now that's different than an investor looking at that same property, looking at what that property brings in every month in cash flow, looking at what type of loan that investor might be able to get to buy that building, looking at what it's going to cost an investor to keep the lights on in that building, to maintain that building, to get a tenant to come in, to pay a broker a commission, to pay a tenant to come in and lease from them. They're going to look at the pricing of that property differently. And we'll get into that a little bit later too. But typically that's the difference when you're discussing a purchase and sale of a property. Is it an owner user or is it an investor? Something very important that I forgot to mention is SBA. If you are a business and you are looking to purchase a property for your business, there is an incredible loan program for you that's through the federal government, and it's called SBA, which stands for the Small Business Administration. There are a few different types of SBA loans, and we have some great members of our CRE chapter who specialize in those types of loans. And so certainly, if you ever have any questions or interested in something like that, please reach out to CRE, and we'll connect you with someone who's really good at that. If I'm an investor looking to buy a property, I'm not going to occupy it, I can't get an SBA loan. Okay. Sale leaseback, again, this is a funky one where it's a little bit of an owner user that gets converted to an investment. So I'm a dentist, I own my building, I am getting ready to retire in 5 years, and so I'm not yet ready to close my business, but I also kind of want to cash out on the equity that I have in this building, you know, so that I can retire, so that I can go to working part-time. I am going to try and sell the building to an investor who would buy it and leave my dental practice in place, and I will pay the new owner rent. So whereas before I was the user of that building, I paid myself rent. Now I'm going to sell that building to a new owner, and I'm going to lease that building back from them. That's what we call a sale leaseback. Little more complicated, kind of goes into CRE 102. 1031 exchange is another transaction type that you may or may not be familiar with, but it's super common in commercial real estate. Right now in the US, there are tax laws that if you sell a commercial property and you profited from that sale, right? You bought it in 2012 and now you sold it in 2020 and you made a profit. Instead of being taxed on that profit, if you take that money that you made and purchase a new property, like and kind, it has to be similar to the property that you bought before. And again, within CRE, we have specialists who focus on 1031 exchanges. So let's do another webinar and they can go into that. But generally, a 1031 exchange is you sell a property, you made a profit. Instead of having to pay a tax on that profit, you can purchase another commercial property that is similar and avoid paying taxes, right? That's a 1031 exchange. Okay. Moving on to some more terms that we talk about a lot in commercial real estate. When you own a building, there are costs to owning that building. Vicki, did you have a tic-tac-toe? I saw Vicky's face, Victoria Ortiz. I saw her face.
I actually yelled bingo, and then I was like, "That's not."
I love it. I love it. Tic-tac bingo, right?
I do. I got Class A, medical, and janitorial.
Perfect. I love it. Has anyone else got one before?
Hey, Lindsay, and I think Rose also got one too. She didn't want to interrupt while you were talking and messaged us in the chat. Rose, what did you get?
Oh yeah, that's
awesome.
Hi,
thanks. Yes, I got Class A, industrial, and retail. So that was early on.
Awesome.
Okay, so I've got Rose, I've got Victoria. Awesome.
And I got flex, cold storage, and Class A, but don't worry about me.
Yeah, no, Pam, we're in on this. We're gonna see how many winners we can get.
Awesome.
Very cool. Okay. Cost of owning, the expenses that come along with owning commercial real estate, right? Similar to expenses that come along with owning your house, right? You buy a house, but you still have to pay your electric bill. You still have to pay a landscaper or do it yourself. You still have to pay a housekeeper or clean it yourself, right? And you still have to pay your property taxes. Same as a commercial building. When we talk about operating expenses, we call these the big five: taxes, insurance, maintenance, utilities, and janitorial. One that is not on here is property management, right? That's another operating expense that, depending on how you look at the operating cost of your building, that is something to look at. Again, that's more of like commercial real estate 102. When we're talking about the big five operating expenses for commercial property, whether it's office, medical, industrial, retail, an auto dealership, a church, a hospital, a hotel, these are the big five, okay? Now, when we talk about lease types, here's where the big five come into play. If you have a full service gross lease, you are probably in one of those Class A office buildings or Class B office buildings, or possibly a Class C office building as well. Full service gross, when we talk about the big five, whatever you pay to the landlord every month in rent covers the big five for your space, okay? If you are in a multi-tenant building, so you're in an office building, a 2-story office building, and there's 10 tenants in that building, you share in the total cost of the building based on the percent of the building that you occupy, right? So if there's 10 offices in a building with 10 different tenants, each office occupies 1,000 square feet, then your share of the costs covers, now I forget the example, 1/10 of it, right? That's a full service gross lease. Everything is included in the rate that you pay the landlord per month. If you are in a modified gross lease, sometimes you'll see that abbreviated as MGR, or if you're looking at, if you're an appraiser, or you're looking at appraisal, and you're looking at lease comps, you'll see them abbreviated as an MGR. What that means is you pay rent to the landlord, but typically you are responsible for 2 of the big 5. And those 2 are your own utilities and your own janitorial. So here's a fun little game that I play every day, right? Someone calls me, okay, well, your landlord wants me to pay $2 a square foot for rent, but the property across the street only wants $1.85 for, and the buildings are comparable. They're in the same place, same type of building. My first question always is, what type of lease is it? What is included? A full service gross lease is most often going to cost you more per month than a modified gross lease rent, right? In a similar type of building. The reason is because full service, I don't have to pay a separate electrical bill. I don't have to, my landlord pays for someone to come in and clean my accounting office 3 days a week or 5 days a week, right? In a modified gross scenario, that's not the case. And that is advantageous to some types of tenants. We talked about a church. If I only occupy a building on Wednesday nights and Sundays, it makes more sense to me to pay directly for the cost of running the HVAC in my church than it does for me to pay the landlord, right? What it costs him, overall in the span of a year. So that's where modified gross comes in. Actually, I'm going to say all. It is very rare, but most of the industrial properties, those flex properties that we talked about, are on some sort of modified gross lease, right? Because if I'm a machine shop and I'm using electricity to run my machines day and night, my electrical bill is going to be higher. And so if I own that property, I want the tenant to pay for their own electrical bill, right? If I have a tenant in my property who's a school and their University of Redlands MBA program, and they're having classes at night after all of my bank tenants leave and my architects and my law firms and my title companies leave the building, now University of Redlands comes in and continues to use my electricity for the, and my bathrooms. I'm going to put them on a modified gross lease because I want them to pay for that cost. So that's kind of the difference there between a full service gross and a modified gross. And again, it's important to understand when you're comparing one property to another or one lease to another, understanding what of the big 5 you as a tenant are going to be responsible for. Or if you own the property, which of the big 5 are you going to charge to your tenants, right? That's the difference in those types of leases. Industrial gross, very similar to modified gross. Many times they're interchangeable. Often, an industrial gross also comes with an additional CAM. So if you're in an industrial, if you're a cabinet guy, right, or a cabinet lady, and you are leasing a flex space, and your lease is an industrial gross lease, you pay your rent, right? You pay for two of the big five, your electrical costs and your janitorial costs, right? And then the landlord is typically going to charge you something called a CAM. And I'll talk about that in a second. It's another minimal fee. It's usually 3 to 5 cents per square foot. So that is another fee that's often charged on top of rent, utilities, janitorial in an industrial gross lease is a CAM fee. And we'll talk about that in a sec. Okay, so back to the big five. Full service gross lease covers all five in the rent. Modified gross lease covers 3 of the 5 in the rent, leaves 2. Triple net lease, and this is where you, the tenant, are responsible for all of the big 5. Yes, that means the property insurance, and yes, that means the property taxes. This is very typical in standalone buildings. Standalone buildings are typically on some sort of triple net lease. This is very common in retail leases. Most retail leases are triple net. And the reason being is because retail uses, again, they vary very much from each other, right? A nail salon operates very differently than a clothing retailer, right? So as a landlord, instead of me trying to figure out, okay, what's the fair share here for everybody, I'm just going to put that all on the tenant, right? So that's a triple net lease. Medical, sometimes you'll see medical, a triple net lease, again, because of their specialty use. But you'll often see, if you hear something referred to as a triple net lease, people will say, well, what are my NNNs? You'll see that in writing. What are my NNNs? What are my triple nets? Really, they go back to the big 5: taxes, insurance, maintenance, utilities, and janitorial. Cool? Okay. Quickly again on a CAM fee. CAM is an acronym for Common Area Maintenance. Fun fact, if a landlord is charging a tenant a CAM fee, it doesn't necessarily have to be for the maintenance of the common areas of the property. Landlords get to basically define what is going to be included in a CAM. So best practices for anyone dealing with commercial property ownership, leasing that space to tenants, anyone involved with tenants who lease space from someone who owns that property, and you're looking at what are their costs, their monthly costs, look at what's included in a CAM, because a landlord can define what that means. I have tenants, I represent actually Victoria Gardens, the owner of Victoria Gardens, and their CAM is very different than a CAM that an owner of a flex industrial property, we keep talking about the cabinet company, has to pay. So CAMs can be whatever the landlord defines them. It's important to understand that. OPEX pass-throughs. OPEX, sometimes you'll see that in writing, or an acronym short for operating expenses. We've talked about those way too much now, the big 5. OPEX pass-throughs, that's another way for landlords to recover operating costs and expenses. So while I may tell you that it is included in your lease rate, if I have, if we have a flood and my parking lot to the property gets damaged, I consider that an operating expense, and I can pass that cost on to my tenants if the lease agreement allows me to do so, right? If the HVAC unit on my building goes out and me, the landlord, I categorize that as an operating expense, and my lease tells me that I can pass through that cost to my tenants, I can do that. That's an OPEX pass-through. Again, that's more of like commercial real estate 102, but just good to know when you are having conversations or looking at documents related to commercial real estate. If you see that, that's what it is. Okay. TIs are another term that we throw around. It's another acronym that we throw around in this industry. If you are a contractor or an architect or an interior designer, or you own a building, you are probably familiar with it. It stands for tenant improvements, and it's fixed and permanent improvements that are performed to the interior of a building. So again, that goes back to ownership, right? If I own the building and I build a restroom inside that building, I have ownership at the end of the day. Even if my tenant who I lease that building to needs that restroom because they are a dental office and they need to have a restroom for their patients in that dental. So that's a TI. At the end of the day, if a dentist is leasing a space for me and the dentist leaves, I still own that restroom, right? The tenant doesn't get to tear it out and take the toilet with them and put it in their new dental office. So tenant improvements are fixed and permanent inside the property. Now, if a tenant hangs up a TV on their wall, right, that's not a tenant improvement. If a tenant, it gets where sometimes they'll build in furniture systems, like they'll build in their reception desk, right? Or they'll build a glass wall for a conference room. May or may not be a tenant improvement. That's stuff that can be negotiated. But tenant improvements are things that are fixed and permanent to the space. Tenant leaves, doesn't get to take it with them. Fun fact, even though we call all of those improvements tenant improvements, in some cases, many cases, the construction of those things are performed by the landlord and often paid for by the landlord, depending on property type, lease type, things like that. So that's something fun to know, is even though we call them tenant improvements, TIs, doesn't necessarily mean the tenant is the one who is responsible for paying for it or building it out. And that goes, again, if you own a building and you're going to build the inside of your building out so that a dentist can come and utilize it for his dentist office, at the end of the day, I own the building, I own all of those improvements. I want to control that process, right? So me, the landlord, I'm going to pay for them, and I'm going to have my contractors come build it, right? A retailer is different. Most of retail tenant improvements are at the cost of the tenant, and at the tenant's own, the tenant takes control of that. If I'm a yoga studio, I want to pick the floors, right? I want to design the look and feel of my yoga studio. I don't want the landlord coming in and telling me that that's, that I have to use these types of floors. I want to use whatever. So still called a tenant improvement, still a permanent and fixed improvement to the inside of a building. But in that case, the tenant is the one paying for it and designing and constructing it. Went way too long there, but that's TIs, okay? Another one I wanted to throw in here because it's a term that has been thrown around a lot in the last 2 months, and unless you are a real estate attorney, you probably were not familiar with it until now, is this term force majeure. And it's a clause in most leases that talks about, that says a tenant, you still have to pay rent to me even if your property floods, even if your property gets broken into, even if the HVAC leaks or there's a heavy rain season and the roof leaks and damages your property, you still have to pay your rent to the landlord. Some leases, many leases, talk about acts of God. Okay, so coronavirus. I cannot occupy my building. The government is telling me I can't occupy my building because I will make people sick if I do. People could die if I do. I shouldn't have to pay rent. Well, yes, you do. If you have this force majeure clause in your lease, depending on how it's worded. So that's a term, again, you've probably heard in the last several weeks, and that's what it addresses. Okay, terms related to the purchase and sale of a building. If you have ever purchased or sold a home, you are likely familiar with most of these. Also, we have such a strong membership within our CRE chapter of professionals who deal with aspects of these. So if you have in-depth questions about these, what they mean, what they should or shouldn't mean, we'll refer you to a CRE member who can help you, but I'll go over them. Title and escrow. Due diligence. Due diligence is, if I am purchasing a property, just like if you have purchased a home, you had a due diligence period. You want to make sure that title is clear. What that means is, does anyone else have ownership rights to this property aside from the person who is selling this property to me, right? Scott is going to sell Lindsay his commercial office building. Okay, I assume Scott knows it, but part of my due diligence is to go through the title process to confirm that Scott does indeed have ownership right and the right to sell me that building, right? That's due diligence. Other facets of due diligence are, I am going to perform a physical inspection of the property, right? Great, Scott tells me that the HVAC was replaced last year and he's never had a plumbing problem and that he put new carpet in, 2 years ago. Cool. Part of my due diligence is I'm going to bring in my own contractors, my own property inspectors, my own plumbers, HVAC technicians to inspect the property and confirm for myself that I am satisfied with the condition of this property, right? That being said, it doesn't mean the property has to be in good condition, right? There's likely a price discount that comes with a property that is in worse condition than a brand newly constructed property, correct? But as a buyer, when I enter into a purchase and sale agreement with someone who's selling the property, part of my due diligence period, and that is always defined in a purchase and sale agreement, I have 10 days, or I have 30 days, or I have 60 days to perform my due diligence and satisfy myself with the asset that I'm buying, right? Another big part that goes into that, if you're buying a multi-tenant property, is you're looking at the leases, right? So Scott tells you, oh yeah, well the dentist leases this for me if he has 7 more years left on his lease. And he pays me, $10,000 a month. Well, part of my due diligence is, okay, well, I want to see the lease and make sure that's what it says. So when you enter into an agreement to purchase a property and sell a property, there is something, again, we call it the due diligence period. It's the length of the period is defined in your agreement. How long does someone have to satisfy themselves with all aspects of the property before they can say, you know what, I don't want to move forward with purchasing this property. And typically whatever I'm going to concern myself with during that due diligence process are contingencies. So here's an example of contingency. I agree to purchase your property for $1 million if I can get $750,000 financed during my 30-day due diligence period. That is one contingency. So once I get that finance in place, I notify Scott, who's selling me his building, that I'm going to waive that contingency. Another contingency is environmental. And when we talk about the environmental condition of a property, what is almost always and often required is a phase 1 report. If you are putting any sort of financing on a property, a phase 1 report is required. I keep using Scott's name because I know that is something that he does, and he's a crew member. But he will tell you, yes, your property, there's no environmental hazard here, or there was a history of an environmental hazard, and now if you're borrowing money to buy a property, the lender is going to say you have to remediate that before we will give you the money to buy this, right? If your dental office used to be a gas station in the 70s, or used to sit on a piece of property that was a gas station in the 70s, there are likely environmental hazards there that will need to be remediated before Wells Fargo will lend you the money to buy that building. Phase 2 takes the environmental even deeper. Again, we have crew members who specialize in those types of things. If you have questions, concerns, or you need someone to perform a phase 1 or a phase 2 inspection for you, or talk about your options for remediating, we can connect you to them. But again, environmental contingency is off at 1. So I have Scott come out, perform a phase 1 inspection of my property. He says, yeah, this dental office is free and clear, no environmental hazard or presence. Now I'm going to waive that contingency. I have satisfied myself that, yes, I will still move forward with buying the property. Once you have waived the contingencies, and again, you have to do that within a defined due diligence period, right? You don't have 3 years to do that because the seller wants to sell at the price that you've agreed to sell it. So 30 days. If you hear someone say, I'll pay all cash and close in 10 days, they aren't specifically concerned with a due diligence period. They're basically saying, I will buy this property exactly in the condition that it's in. Leases, whatever the leases say, whatever the environmental reports come back at. Typically, due diligence period is like 30, 60 days. Some properties, again, if you have a real complicated warehouse, well, I want 90 days because I know that I'm going to need 90 days to do all the environmental inspections. Regardless of the length of your due diligence period and the number of contingencies you have, it will be defined in your purchase and sale agreement how long you have to do that and when your good money, good faith deposit that you gave to the seller at the beginning of this goes non-refundable. That's a term we talk about a lot. Oh, it's going non-refundable. Well, I have to finish, I have to get this phase 1 because I go non-refundable in 5 days. I've got to review all these leases because I'm going non-refundable at the end of the month. What that means is your due diligence period is expiring and that deposit and you put in now goes to the seller, whether or not you ultimately decide to buy the property or not. So if during your due diligence period, you waived your financing contingency, hoping that, yeah, okay, I know that this loan is going to go through. The bank is telling me it's going to take 60 days to get approved instead of 30 days. Well, if your due diligence period is 30 days, at the 30 days is over, you have to give your deposit to the seller. The seller gets to keep your deposit. Even if your bank comes through 60 days later and says, sorry, we can't fund you. So that's how we talk about going non-refundable. Certainly, if you request an extension, you're typically requesting additional time to perform a term rent inspection, get an environmental report, interview the tenants, things like that. You can extend that due diligence period by requesting an extension. Again, we have professionals within CRE who can help you with all of that. And if you've ever bought a house, you are perhaps a little familiar with some of that or all of that process. Cool? All right. This is where we get into CRE 200, I call it. This is real estate investment terms. And certainly we could do a whole other Zoom call that talks about these, but here are the basic ones that you are likely familiar with. If you haven't heard it yet, you will likely hear it in the course of your career. And generally, here's what they mean. If a property is leveraged, remember, investment is when you're buying a property. If a property is leveraged, that means you have financing on the property. So most of us, our homes that we live in is leveraged, right? Unleveraged means I own that property free and clear. I bought it in cash. The reason that we use those terms when we talk about investing in commercial real estate is because it is the basis for how we calculate what it costs you to own that property, right? If I purchase a commercial property for $1 million cash, and then I'm looking at it from the income that I'm going to get every month for tenants. So say I have a tenant in there who's going to pay me $10,000 a month. I buy the property, $1 million cash. The tenant is going to pay me $10,000 a month. Well, I will have my money back, after how many months, right? Do the math. If I only put, let's say I take that same $1 million property and I only put $50,000 of my own money in it. I borrow the other $950,000 to buy it. Well, now part of my operating expenses is my debt service, right? So even though I'm getting $10,000 a month from the tenant, my mortgage on the property is $5,000 a month, right? So I have to take that into consideration when I am looking at what my return will be on this investment. So that's important to know whether someone owns the property leveraged or unleveraged, whether they're planning to purchase it leveraged or unleveraged. NOI is one we talk about a lot, specifically with regard to commercial real estate investing, but also outside of that context as well. NOI stands for net operating income. And net operating income is The simple formula is you take the gross rent. Okay, so my dentist pays me $10,000 a month to lease my building from me. And then I subtract out the big five: taxes, insurance, maintenance, utilities, janitorial. Take the rent, say he pays me $10,000 a month. It costs me $5,000 a month for the big five. My net operating income, my NOI, is $5,000 a month. Cool. Cap rate is another term that we talk about a lot with regard to real estate investing. There is a formula to figure it out. It is a simple formula, but at the sake of getting everyone glazed over, just know this: cap rate is generally a description of the ratio of what it cost you to purchase the property compared to your net operating income. And again, I won't go into details how you calculate that right now, but it is a term that we use to compare one investment to another. And here's how cap rate works. The higher the cap rate, the lower the purchase price. And so if I'm a buyer, I am typically looking for properties with a higher cap rate. Higher cap rate means lower purchase price. If I am a seller, then I prefer the inverse, right? Lower cap rates mean higher sales price. So if I own a retail center and I bought it at the crash of the market in 2010, 2009, 2010, I bought it at a 15 cap. Now it's 2020. Let's take 2020 out of it. 2020 sucks. Now it's 2019, okay? And I want to sell my property. Well, remember, I bought it 10 years ago at a 15 cap. Well, now I want to sell it at a 4 cap, right? That's the difference in the pricing. So that's one way to look at cap rate. Is really just a way to compare one real estate investment to another. I had another thought. Hopefully it'll come to me. Cap rate also will speak a lot of times to the credit of the tenants, right? So if I own one of those convenience centers, one of those strip centers where I have, a Mexican restaurant and a nail salon, and a little boutique clothing store, all of whom have had to close their doors, right? And I'm thinking, okay, I want to get out of this asset. I would rather take that money and own a Starbucks, right? Because Starbucks is still open. Well, I'm not going to be able to buy a Starbucks at the same cap rate that you can buy a convenience center, right? So Starbucks, are typically sold at a 4 cap versus, here's an automotive building. This is at a 6 cap. Or here's a multi-tenant office building in the Inland Empire. I'm going to sell it to you for a 7 cap. That's what cap rate is. IRR takes everything I just said and makes it 100 more times complicated. Okay. Again, there are like advanced real estate investing courses that talk about IRR. What's important for our takeaway today is that we know that it's a term that talks about the return that you will get on a real estate investment is IRR. Replacement cost talks about what it would take to replicate a building. So that dentist office that I keep talking about, if I were to buy it and take a bulldozer and blow it down, what would it cost me to rebuild that very same building, right? If I can buy it for $1 million, but it would cost me $2 million to rebuild it from the ground up, to buy the land, put in the infrastructure, build the walls, right? Build out the interior, the replacement cost is $2 million. So you'll see properties talked about in that way. Oh, it's far below replacement cost. Basically, it's saying you can own this building for less than what it would cost you to build this building on your own. And then comps, we use the term comps a lot, which is short for comparables. Again, there are lease comps and sale comps. I lease my office space for $1.50 a square foot. You lease yours for $1.40. That's the comp. What's the lease comp? Am I paying a fair price? Again, if you've bought or sold a home, we use this in residential real estate too. Okay, the house across the street from me sold for 500,000. I could sell, that's a good comp for me. That's a good sale comp for me. I could sell my house for 500,000. So that's comps. All right, that was a lot. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and would love to stick around. First of all, to recognize anyone who got a tic-tac-toe, answer any questions. And like I said, if you have a question on a real estate term and I cannot answer it for you, you will also go on my list to win a prize. Thank you so much for hanging in there. I know I talked a lot. Hopefully the slides and everything were helpful.